My name is Dr. Julie Ellison-Speight. I'm the Associate Director of the University of Arizona Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And as a part of that position, I'm Executive Director for two summer study abroad programs. One program is the Arizona and Jordan program, where I send students to Amman, Jordan to study Arabic. And the other program is Arizona and Turkey, where I send students to study Turkish in Istanbul. As a part of this role, we prepare students to go overseas for the summer. One thing we try to do is explain different feelings students experience. And as you are all students of life, this counts for you too. When students go to a place and live for months, they're bound to experience different feelings. For instance, one matter that often arises is students experiencing culture shock. They feel really out of place. The term culture shock references an experience of going to a country and just feeling totally out of place in it. This type of feeling can arise at the beginning, end, or middle of the student's day, or not at all. Students on exchange often have these experiences. Also, sometimes during their trip, something else occurs. It's where the students have acclimatized and become familiar with the new culture, so much so that then when they return home to their home country, they feel out of place. So it's really hard not to belong. That's another type of related issue called reverse culture shock. They have changed, these students that experience this have changed and really begun to understand the culture they were visiting. And the world they have remembered in their home country has gone on without them. Slang words might have slightly changed because popular culture changes swiftly, and some new cultural references may have arisen in their absence. Knowing that these different feelings might arise for a student, and in this case, you as a life student, is one way of being able to cope with the experiences and to make sense of it, because it's a lot of information and it feels sort of overwhelming at the time you're experiencing it. So being prepared for it is a really important matter. One other program where I've dealt with intercultural competence is a virtual exchange program. You're probably wondering why I'm mentioning how people feel during a virtual exchange as opposed to an in-person experience. The students in the virtual exchange, which I ran for 2 years, were working closely with architecture students from Egypt in small groups on projects with tight deadlines. The university in the Middle East we collaborated with, all the students spoke English, at least as a second, if not a third language. Regardless, there were bound to be some matters of miscommunication. They definitely happen. And I often got texts from students, the ones primarily that were based in the US. And notice I did not state a particular nationality because I had some UA students who were from different Middle Eastern countries taking part on the UA side. And they were asking questions about their colleagues in Egypt. It's important to note, while some overarching things exist about Middle Eastern culture, it varies by country to country and region to region. For instance, one of the countries I spent more time in recently, there are 12 different main Moroccan dialects of Darija, and it sounds different from the north to the south. So things vary, and sometimes it's good to ask. You have so many good people to ask questions about Middle Eastern and Jordanian culture, feel free. My students often worry about asking dumb questions, and I always told them the only dumb question is the one you did not ask. Instead of wondering if you're offending people, ask them how they would do something if you feel slightly uncomfortable about just being direct. Knowing it's okay to make a mistake, and the smaller miscommunications can lead to shared memories and a better, more in-depth cultural understanding, is an open-minded way of approaching the world and achieving true intercultural competence. Also, should you be one of the students who falls in love and really manages to immerse yourself in the culture, know that these feelings of reverse culture shock will often equalize pretty quickly as well. If they don't, there are so many resources out there as opposed to 20 years ago that we have access to now. And please feel free to email me at jellison@arizona.edu, and I can put you in contact with someone to assist. If for some reason I don't respond within 2 or 3 days, feel free to reach out to me again. Just hit reply on the email and say, I'd like to bring this to the top of your pile. My email's a bit busier than it used to be, but you're important, and we want to make sure that you have all the resources you need to have a wonderful experience. The students who take a while to equalize back in their country have gained a certain level of intercultural competence. It doesn't mean they're done learning. I'm still learning about Middle Eastern culture 20 years later. True intercultural competence takes a long period of time, and especially if you deal in multiple different countries in the region. I spent summers in Morocco and Tajikistan. Tajikistan is Central Asia. It's technically not the Middle East, but it does speak a dialect of Persian Tajik, which is written in Cyrillic script. I've also spent a couple weeks in Egypt, a couple in Jordan, another week 14 years later in Morocco, 3 weeks or 4 weeks in Turkey, and a couple days in Oman, looking at an Arabic program there. It has been such a privilege to travel all over the region, and one thing I noticed is people are all curious about all parts of the world. The stereotypes people in Tajikistan had about Morocco were based on a TV show called Clone. It's a Brazilian soap opera that was dubbed in Moroccan Arabic when I was there in 2004 about an elite Moroccan family that had 2 wives and, all these things. Most of the time, you don't see, unless you meet the super wealthy, 2 wives, because you're supposed to be able to treat all your wives equally in Islam. And that would require quite a bit of money. But then years later, I saw the same series in 2009 in Tajikistan, dubbed in Russian, one day when I was home from school sick. The host family I was staying with in Tajikistan at the time thought my Russian had improved dramatically, which incidentally, I only have a couple words like kartushka, pomidor. So, potato and tomato are about it. But I had a good time, and I let the family think I had, picked up more Russian, and then explained I'd watched the same series many years before in Moroccan dialect, or dubbed over in Moroccan dialect, which I have studied. So the family in Tajikistan laughed, and then the questions came. And the questions came at first about Morocco, but then they came about, the US. So being open to those questions is important, and it increases intercultural competence in so many different ways. So I had gained a certain level of intercultural competence by living with that host family in Tajikistan. When the family invited me out to ice cream one night, I was so excited. Then they said raftim, and I was so confused. They had said we went in Persian. I stopped tying my shoes, thinking I had missed the treat. But it turned out that was a way that wasn't taught in the language books that I had studied. They were basically saying, let's get a move on. And the ice cream definitely smoothed things over, and we all had a good giggle about it. So now that I've used the word quite a few times, what do I mean by intercultural competence? Intercultural competence is the ability to develop targeted knowledge, skills, and attitudes that lead to visible behavior and communication that are both effective and appropriate in intercultural interactions. When people really begin to understand another culture, they have a high level of understanding about the culture. Since I've spent many years studying the Middle East, I've learned a couple of things. For instance, inshallah, God willing, if someone says it and makes direct eye contact and sounds earnest, then they most likely really mean they're going to really do it or really try to do it. If they say inshallah and they look at the ground and it's a little slower, then the statement probably has less intention, but it also might be because they're unable to do it, they know it, but they don't want to offend, because it's hard to be direct sometimes in certain parts of the Middle East. Like, they don't want to directly refuse you. So they're trying to be polite, save face, and be kind, but just know that you need to pay attention to body language and facial expressions and to really listen, because if inshallah is said looking and smiling, it's more likely to mean what you want it to mean. Now, another example of learning a lot of Middle Eastern culture that I can draw on is watching a family interact. When the person was watching, none of the children were saying please. That struck the person who observed this behavior as rude, because please in American culture is considered the magic word. The American asked the family they witnessed the behavior with the children, and the family members, like the elders, explained that adding that level of formality of saying please would mean the family wasn't as close. The main point of the story is to say that when something seems odd or out of place in a situation, asking about that matter that is confusing can add to you gaining intercultural competence. Another Middle Eastern example is yani, which literally means it means. Often when I deal with students whose first language is Arabic and they are learning English, it will be mingled throughout their speech in English. Can you think of one example of a word or phrase we put in our speech when we don't know what to say next and we're speaking in a formal environment? Maybe? I've always found it interesting the Arabic filler word yani actually has a meaning. As a side note, when students switch between languages throwing words from the other language, that's a field of linguistic study called code switching. And sometimes if you spend enough time in another culture, a foreign word sometimes has a better fit than the English equivalent. So I often, especially when I haven't had enough caffeine, will code switch accidentally English to Persian. Okay, so to be aware of that. Now, to compare yani from Arabic to an English expression, here's one that has been pointed out to me by a professor. The American expression that I know that is unusual for non-native English speakers is okay. Similar to inshallah, it can have many meanings. It can be dismissive, okay. It can mean all right. It can mean so many different things depending on how the speaker says it, how they look at the person that they're speaking to, and what the intention is. So looking at another culture also causes one to be more self-reflexive on the current culture they inhabit or are a part of. It's also natural to compare the culture you come from to that which you are visiting. It's how we make connections and understand. As you are all on this trip, I imagine you are already forming connections, but I figure it's still good to voice this concept out loud. Intercultural competence is not something easily measured, and it's taken a long time to develop. That being said, there are a lot of measures that can be used. One of the very simple measures that you can do, especially with yourself or with students, is right after you go to hear a speaker in Jordan, write down what you found interesting, what you didn't understand, just 2 or 3 sentences to really summarize what you got out of the experience and a question you had. So even if you don't have time to ask it in that moment, that it's there, you've got it recorded, and you can come back to it later. But having students do that consistently on their study abroad, we've definitely found that is a good, easy way to get a mark of intercultural competence in the things that they begin to understand as they go throughout the course of the summer. There's a wonderful conference held every other year. It happened in January 2020 of this year by the Center for Educational Resources, Culture, Language, and Literacy, which is a language resource center, or LRC, funded by Title VI U.S. Department of Education funds. And Circle is at the University of Arizona. The Intercultural Competence Conference draws in many people from all over the world. It has large chunks online, so you can register online. The next one would be 2022. And so you can hear experts talk. The in-person aspect is good too, because then you get a lot more, one-on-one time to ask questions, which I definitely had a lot of questions in 2018 and 2020. So when I went, in 2018, when I went, I heard a wonderful keynote speaker, Professor Robert O'Dowd from the University of Lyon. He was talking about virtual exchange and how having students collaborate on subject matter versus language was the next frontier to move from pure intercultural contact to intercultural competency acquisition and actual learning. He was talking about getting past the binary. I have to say, at that moment in my life, it was pretty intimidating for me to hear a speech because I was signed up to run the one virtual exchange program on a subject matter only a couple of weeks later. he discussed a bit of a longer timeline to have such a startup of a project. But sometimes I guess it's best to go in a bit foolhardy and full of hope. And it worked out fantastically. And there's been other projects that have emerged from the one that I ran. So another big name besides O'Dowd for you all to know in the field of intercultural competence is Professor Darla Deardorff. Her model is referenced in the sheet I gave Renee to share with you all. The famous article is The Identification and Assessment of Intercultural Competence as a Student Outcome of Internationalization at Institutions of Higher Education in the United States. It appeared in 2006 in the Journal of Studies in International Education. University of Washington has another handout available if you Google Deardorff Intercultural Competence that visually illustrates desired internal and external outcomes of intercultural competence, including openness, flexibility, and a lot of the other points I've tried to make with you all throughout this talk. One expression that you will hear throughout Jordan is Ya'atik al-Afia, may God give you strength, and that is specifically God give you strength, and you're saying that to a man. Female would be Ya'tiki al-Afia. Tiki indicates you're saying it to a female. The long story short is that the greeting is used mostly in Jordan. It's rarely said elsewhere. So when you continue on your travels, which I hope that this causes you to want to go to different places. For instance, if you go to Morocco in future, just know Moroccans will hear that phrase, and most will recognize you've had some exposure to Jordanian or Levantine Arabic, and they might switch to that Arabic to address you. If you want to find simple phrases in Jordanian dialect, just Google Jordanian Arabic Peace Corps, and you should get the manual. I think you all actually have a more comprehensive manual for Arabic, for Jordanian Arabic, but because I have studied Darija or Moroccan dialects, I usually just download the Peace Corps guide for Jordanian Arabic when I travel there for a quick trip. Being able to say hello, thank you, goodbye, and wishing people strength really goes a long way towards starting a positive conversation that can result in gained levels of intercultural competence. My goal with this talk is to know if something strikes you as odd or uncomfortable, you're welcome to reach out to me or to all the people involved with this Fulbright Hayes Group Projects Abroad. Don't just wonder and feel uncomfortable. Use it as a way to start a conversation that can advance your intercultural competence, because we wish to see you embrace Jordanian culture. Thank you for your time, and I wish you a wonderful trip.